Let me give you a couple arguments, all right?
Okay.
So first, if you look at the history of the last 40, 45 years of American politics, the Democrats do right-wing things, and the Republicans win by criticizing those right-wing things and then use those right-wing things to create space to do more right-wing things, right? So even go all the way back to Lyndon Johnson. He's got to do Vietnam because in the 50s, the Democrats were accused of being soft on communism. So he's terrified to leave Vietnam and look soft. Nixon goes, we need peace with honor in Vietnam. Johnson can't do it. And then he gets in off that and then bombs the hell out of Cambodia, right? Jimmy Carter, he appoints Paul Volcker chairman of the Federal Reserve. Paul Volcker jacks up the interest rate, jacks up unemployment, huge recession in 1980, right? Reagan goes, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? No, you're not. And then he does more jacking up the interest rate, more recession, more union crushing, more of all of that. Bill Clinton in the 90s, he's trying to cut spending. He's trying to have this big budget surplus. He murders welfare. What does George W. Bush go? Well, there's this big budget surplus, so let's give it back to the American people in a tax cut, right? Trying to give the people back the money. No, it's tax cuts to the rich. But he uses the opening given to him by Bill Clinton. In the case of Barack Obama, he agrees to sequestration. He agrees to the Budget Control Act of 2011. That means in all these red states where the Republican governors are cutting, there's no federal money coming to offset. So there's no job growth in the rural counties in those states. Those counties feel forgotten. They don't blame their Republican governors. They blame the Democratic president. And they vote for Trump, who promises that they won't be forgotten anymore. On fracking, Barack Obama fracks the hell out of everything, collapses the oil price by 50% over the course of his administration. And then we get coronavirus, which collapses it again. How's alternative energy supposed to compete with that? These are the most consequential decisions, and none of them are ever in the platform. None of them are ever policies that these people talk about during the campaign. We wouldn't be able to talk about the fracking. We wouldn't be able to talk about Libya, the Libyan intervention in 2011. We wouldn't be able to talk about any of these things in 2008, or any of the stuff Bill Clinton did in 1992, or any of the stuff Carter did in 1976, because none of it is ever part of the policy platform. The worst stuff that the Democrats do is always stuff that they don't mention at all. They don't really mention it at all, and they spring it on you during the term, and everybody lets it go. The Republicans, of course, are going to support it, and the left is going to be tame because they don't want to look like they're opposing the Democratic president. So the Democrat gets away with it. Now, on the other side of this, right, I want you to think about 2004. This is my second argument, right? In 2004, Democrats ran John Kerry, this milquetoast centrist who's totally into all kinds of foreign intervention, right? They run John Kerry, and John Kerry doesn't win. And because John Kerry doesn't win, George W. Bush gets the blame for Iraq. He gets the blame for Katrina. He gets the blame for 2008. The bottom drops out of his popularity from 2005 on. By 2008, like Donald Trump said, Abraham Lincoln couldn't have won that election for the Republicans. It's such a disaster. Everybody's blaming George W. Bush. It's a huge opening. Now, we waste that opening on Barack Obama, who squanders it, okay? But even the rump leftover bits of that opening are what gets us the Bernie movement and what gets us what we have and what we are and what we're doing, right? So if John Kerry wins that election in 2004, and I think John Kerry and Joe Biden are very similar politicians with very similar positions, John Kerry would have, of course, not been able to resolve the situation in Iraq. And the Republicans would have said, Iraq would have worked out if we'd stuck with George W. Bush. John Kerry's weak, and that's why we lost, right? He wouldn't have been able to do anything different in Katrina. FEMA would not have been in dramatically better shape with John Kerry. There's no obvious reason to think that it would have been. And then on 2008, that has roots that go way, way back in our political economy. That's not exclusively a George W. Bush problem. So John Kerry would have gotten the blame for all of those things, and the Democrats would have gotten the blame. And because the Republicans say that the Democrats are socialists, we would have gotten the blame. And you can see this in Britain. In Britain, Gordon Brown was prime minister in 2008. And Gordon Brown got the blame for 2008, and the Labour Party and the left got the blame. And in Britain, most people believe that the 2008 crash happened because Labour spent too much money in the 2000s. Now, the Conservative Party in 2005 was promising to do the same spending that Labour was promising. And it fueled this narrative that it was left-wing economics in the 2000s that led to the crash, and that fueled the austerity, it fueled the cuts, and it fueled the movement of the Conservative Party dramatically to the right, led to Brexit, led to Boris Johnson, is leading to terrible disruption in the European Union. So we have to think about not just individual isolated issues, but where this sits in the trajectory of the country and what produces a trend line that is more favorable to us. And electing the Democrat in the middle, the Democrats always nominate the worst centrist when they're trying to challenge a Republican incumbent. That's always when they nominate the worst possible person. That person isn't going to do a better job, and then we're going to get the blame. We're going to be sitting here in 4 years if Joe Biden wins, if not 4 years, 8 years. Maybe the Republicans will nominate a Romney type and a Democrat will win again in 2024. But sooner or later, 4 years or 8 years from now, we're going to get the blame. We, the left, are going to get the blame for the horrible, horrible centrist crap that Joe Biden does. And the country's going to respond by moving further to the right. And it's going to pick a Republican that is worse than Donald Trump, someone who has been inspired by Donald Trump and is willing to take that in a much, much more aggressive direction. Donald Trump is a safe ass clown who is hated by the military, is hated by the Central Intelligence Agency, doesn't have a whole lot of support among troops. There's no movement in the government to turn Donald Trump into an authoritarian kingpin. But if we stay on the same trajectory, if we follow the same trend line and we don't do something to disrupt the trend, we could, in 4 years, 8 years, 12 years, somewhere, end up with a Republican that's worse. And we've been on this path where every Republican is worse than the previous Republican for a long time.
I just want to give people a chance to just let me interject, and then I'll pass it on to people to respond. I just want to kind of to put your thing in a bracket. You're saying that it's not necessarily in this like individual term that Biden would be. You're not denying that Trump may be worse than Biden if he were be elected in this term, but you're saying it's overall a dangerous arc, and that just strategically, Dems would be maybe better positioned to let a Republican win this time so that Trump will continue to get the blame.
Well, that, and I do also think that sometimes Democrats do astoundingly terrible things that Republicans would not be able to get away with because they won't be opposed by Democrats.
It takes a liberal as they say, you know, I was thinking
Nixon goes to China.
Right. And when you brought the question up to Eugene, Aaron, I was thinking of with NAFTA and George H.W., like sometimes, you know, I think Thomas Frank quotes someone in Listen Liberal where it's like it takes a liberal sometimes to do that, like to get NAFTA through. It takes a liberal because there's not as much opposition. At the same time, I would argue against you, Benjamin, in the case of Katrina, because I don't know it's a counterfactual, but I could easily have seen Kerry taking the reports more seriously about the levees going, you know, breaking.
It certainly would not be a heck of a job, Brownie.
Right.
So I also think I think my take on what you just said is I think it is accurate 100% that we have this situation, right, where the sort of centrism, neoliberalism triangulation of the Democratic Party is so terrible and awful that it's leading to, it's actually playing into a future sort of fascism. It really is, right? Like, because the problem in this country is also that we don't have left movements. I disagree that the answer to that is to let a Republican win. I don't think that that's going to fix things. But I do think, yes, I worry about 4 to 8 years from now, after 4 to 8 years of a Biden-Harris administration, we're going to have a very charming, more effective version than Donald Trump. Because things aren't going to get materially better for a lot of people in the country, for working class people. We're going to have like a Tom Cotton or a Candace Owens or someone we haven't even heard yet. And that's really scary to think about. I don't think that another Trump presidency is necessarily going to make that not happen. And I actually think the way to avoid that is left movement building, which we don't have enough of. Like, I think Eugene made a really good point that we put way too much emphasis on elections and like changing things structurally in this country through the electoral system, when that's not actually I don't think, it doesn't seem historically that things necessarily change that way. Things change, like Eugene mentioned, from like movements, independent voices and independent movements on the ground. And that is what we need more of, because right now, like the right wing is the one that has the media apparatus to like appeal to all the disaffected people who are angry at the system. You know,
which is why you can support our Patreon.
Right, which is why, but we don't have cable news outlets to like give people a left narrative to help them understand why their life is like, why they're in such economic precarity. Like, we don't have that sort of megaphone. So I think that like that doesn't change regardless of who gets elected. The left is still in a weak position. So I think the question becomes, how do we make the left stronger? I definitely don't think another term of Trump would make the left stronger. In fact, I think the last 4 years of Trump have moved the entire country, including liberals, to like further to the right. Because he literally has just moved the entire country further more to the right with Russiagate. And then everything becomes about resistance to Trump. So like the couple of things that he's been like okay on, like North Korea, it's like now everybody's like anti, sitting down with the leader of North Korea.
Everyone's anti doing the thing that Obama did and was praised by liberals for doing, and right wing hated him for. Omar, and then Aaron, and then
sure. That reversal of roles, by the way, is indeed stunning. I mean, it tells you something about sort of the partisan hackery of the entire political culture in this country to some extent. But honestly, I mean, look, this last point that Rania just made, that Eugene made earlier, about the fact that there's an overemphasis on electoral politics and that movement building is how you actually achieve change. There is no question that that is true. And I think a lot of what Eugene said is 1,000% correct, but none of it tells you why you shouldn't reduce harm during the election by voting Trump out of office. None of all that movement building that's really important can happen in addition to voting out the worst of two evils. It's a problem that we don't have a real progressive option. The fact that both parties on way too many issues are too similar, and in some cases there are no differences at all. But simply allowing Trump to win another election does absolutely nothing to move the Democrats left or in a more progressive direction. I mean, it just happened in 2016 with Hillary Clinton. The left was disaffected. They were not happy about it. Many of them sat out, and here we are 4 years later, and they're nominating Joe Biden. So it's not like the Democrats move in a more progressive direction when progressives simply sit out these elections. So you still can do all of this absolutely important and critical work that you're talking about. But when it comes to election day, there is a responsibility to pull the lever to reduce harm in that specific moment without necessarily undermining all of that other work that needs to be done. And on the point that Benjamin was making earlier, I mean, on sort of the idea that we have a balance of blame, to a game to play with that, to try to move the country in one direction or the other. First, I think that's very speculative. It's very difficult to get a strict trajectory on how that ends up moving. And in the meantime, I don't think, Benjamin, you described Trump as a safe clown. I don't think there's anything safe about having Trump in office. And particularly for the people who are most vulnerable, for the children who are still getting separated. I mean, they claim that the policy ended, but it hasn't. For the kids who will never see their parents again, for the people in Iran who are suffering, for the people in Palestine who are suffering, for the climate of the entire planet that is degrading very quickly. I don't think it's safe to say, let Trump do incredibly horrible shit and destroy half the planet and cause immense suffering in the hope that this one day will cause a progressive shift in our political discourse. That seems to be too high a risk. And it brings me back to the idea that we do have real work to do to try to shift the political conversation in a more productive direction through movement building that does not happen through elections. But I still feel that it's absolutely critical that on election day, there is a clear choice to make, and the choice to reduce harm ought to be the one that we make.
Aaron, do you want to?
Yeah, I totally agree with everything Omar said. We live in the present. Anything is possible in the future, and I'm not going to vote to murder more Iranian kids on the off chance that maybe something worse than Trump could come along. I can't actually imagine something worse than Trump. And even if something worse than Trump comes along in the future, I'm concerned with avoiding the worst right now. Biden is boxed in on many issues that will lead to tangible good. The Democrats have, after January 2017, decided to become advocates for undocumented immigrants, whereas before that they were deporting them and caging them. Biden is boxed in on that now. It will be very difficult for him to continue the Obama-Biden immigration policy under a Biden administration now. And if he does, he can be called on it very easily. And there's a big grassroots mobilization around that could possibly be harnessed. So there's all these, again, countless issues where you can point to there's such a higher probability or even a guarantee that Biden will cause so much less suffering and death that the argument that possibly something worse than Trump might come along in 4 years or 8 years is just not enough to negate that. I can't even believe it's even up for discussion.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought experiment. There's no question about it if you're just sitting and analyzing. But again, consequential morality, if the lives of people are in your hands, in a sense, as a voter in this
Well,
case. Then
I don't.
But I do think it's an interesting question, and I'd love to get Eugene's take on this. Actually, I do think it's an interesting question about what do you do about the fact that, because there actually is worse than Trump. Trump is a clown. Trump is a clown. He's not the most effective person in his position. But in 4 to 8 years, that is legitimate. That in 4 to 8 years there will be I mean, that is true. There is going to be a more charming version of Donald Trump. That is going to happen.
Who hasn't alienated? The most dangerous thing is that he won't have alienated the security and intelligence communities, which is what I think Benjamin said. But yes,
like a Tom
Eugene.
Cotton, the Pentagon will love him. So Eugene, how do we address that 4 to 8 years? What's your take on that?
Well, I don't want to address the 4 to 8 years because, again, I actually think the exact same thing is true. I mean, I also want to deal in the present, not the future. And what potentially could happen under Biden and what he may or may not be boxed in on is a whole different issue. And I think there's a lot of things people thought Obama was boxed in on, namely EFCA and the public option, that didn't happen. But I mean, I'm not disagreeing with the idea that, well, certainly not that Trump is bad, but that different people have different consequences in terms of what they do. What I'm disagreeing on is that this is that the idea that this is a clear harm reduction argument is in fact the case. I do not agree, and I do not think is the correct premise. I mean, I don't want to go through the things that I listed before, and I think you make a very good point, Aaron, that can you say Trump wouldn't do worse, but we're talking about what are the actual outcomes. So the reality is, living in Washington, D.C. for 15 years and that being my formative experience around the issue of gentrification, knowing that there's going to still be an ongoing move to completely move almost all poor, working class, and exploited people out. It'll be done by Democrats. It'll be done with the money and the programs developed by allegedly progressive person that Joe Biden is going to sit there at HUD. Or that, for instance, he may take Mayor Muriel Bowser from Washington, D.C. and put her in the Department of Education and think about the terrible things she's done to destroy public unions, to gut public teachers unions, to promote the billionaire agenda of charter schools, or one of her #1 funders, along with other things. And again, and I don't want to make this an overly over point, but I mean, the issue of police murder is one of the issues that's the most in front of us right now, and is one of the most bipartisan issues in terms of harm that's actually being reduced when you think of the people who are dead, who are never coming back, who have Joe Biden surrogates, who are the ones who are defending them case in and case out, day in and day out, and putting up and taking in this $20 billion to form these programs. This, just like Clinton said, he had the cops. It was supposed to be all fuzzy and friendly, but it ended up being one of the greatest propaganda apparatuses for mass incarceration, occupied militarized policing. So I don't think you can actually say pulling the lever for Biden. We could go through the different policies. We can.
Okay, can I ask you this? What about
justice for people? So let me just make one final point, because I think here's the real question for me. And the real question is not what's going to happen in 4 to 8 years. It's not, are the Democrats going to move left? It's like, what do we actually have to do to start to break that consensus? And I think when you look historically, it's undeniable. Whether we're talking about the Free Soil Party and the Liberty Party, whether we're talking about the Republican fusion, the early populist party in the 1880s, whether we're talking about the movement behind Henry Wallace that of course lost, but was the thing that got Truman to actually say the word civil rights and bring it into a platform and veto Taft-Hartley. And then those heavily maligned individuals who backed the Progressive Party were the initial cradle of support for the early Martin Luther King and the early civil rights movement. I think we've seen time and time again that in fact it's the insurgent challenges of movements that are willing to raise their own voice on their own terms, even when it feels like, yes, the deck is stacked against you, that start to create the polarizations in times like these that are so important that we really cannot wait, because none of these people are talking about solutions that are going to meet the scale of the problem. So either way, we're talking about fighting. I'm talking about how are we going to use this election to gather forces so that we aren't sitting here in 4 years, so that the guy who just got out of prison in Florida, who got his right to vote back to an amendment, who wants to go vote on the amendment that you all should vote on if you vote in Florida to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, but says, hey, I can't vote for Joe Biden. This dude is responsible for the policies that put me in jail. I don't view that as harm reduction or a positive thing. So I'm going to vote for Gloria LaRiva on the Florida ballot, that he's not the enemy, and that's a logical reaction.
Except
and that
it was Republican judges
take him into an active political participant, not just someone who sits on the sidelines, which is how the 74 million working class people who didn't vote in 2016 often feel, because they feel like they're being imputed with their hands being dirty or this being a negative moral choice, when they're just trying to live their own reality and look for a politics politics that speaks to that. And I think you have to raise that up, and you have to lift up that voice in the wilderness. And what would any of the things we talk about be if in tough moments people didn't do that, even when the obvious choice seemed like it was maybe one that led to a hard road? I mean, there's no denying that, but it's a hard road either way.
Hard, but the question is it harder? I mean, in Florida, they passed a referendum that allowed people who have criminal records to vote, and then Republican judges got in the way of that and made sure that the will of the people is not heard. You mentioned the issue of police killings of Black people. Yes, Biden's policy on this is going to suck, but you have Trump who's flat out waging war on Black America and describing the BLM movement as a racist movement.
I do want to say something. I do want to add.
Someone's going to be in there. Someone's going to be in there. It's going to be either Biden.
Dallas.
It's going to be either Biden or Trump doing it.
Let me make a quick point. I want to make a
departments under the control of Democrats. If we're going to talk about Trump is waging a war on Black America, I mean, I'm sorry, I don't mean to get up in arms, but like, let's just be realistic here. Let's look at the Democratic legislatures who won't raise 10 to above the poverty level, leaving millions of people living in poverty for hundreds of millions of dollars, pennies.
Not disputing that at all. But is Trump better? The only question is Trump better?
You can't just say that it's a straight up harm reduction argument.
On this, it's not, right? Like on some issues,
well,
it's
you
not.
Can't we make that argument? Can't we say the Democrats are terrible, the Republicans are extra terrible, and
No.